Well, I'm going to talk about the third quarter of Wuthering Heights here in case I can't make it to class. Looks like a virus is making its way around our family. So, and excuse me for talking quietly. I'm trying not to wake everybody up. But I know we've been going through kind of slowly. So I just want to start with a couple of things in chapter 14, 15, and then I'll kind of pick up the pace to get us back on track. All right, so you notice that we left last time, right? Heathcliff left and it came back, and all of a sudden he's miraculously rich, but hasn't like completely ascended class. And like I said, I'm really kind of this reading through, doing a lot of like Marxist reading, and because it just keeps popping out to me. So I'll be making some lip service to that. Heathcliff's coming back, and he's like rich, but he still hasn't quite ascended class, right? And so it's this idea that there's this frail other part of being gentility, right? And being gentility literally meant that you own land and therefore did not have to work a job, that you like rented the land and managed it or whatever. If you've ever seen like Downton Abbey, something like that, is the kind of the end of that era. But anyways, Heathcliff, but so he's got the money part, right? And so he should be there, but he's still not allowed in, as it were. And he doesn't have the manners and the other things that are like kind of like part of that culture, I guess. And so he still feels an outcast, and we still have lots of symbols of him being an outcast throughout this section, even though he's like the richest guy all of a sudden, miraculously, mysteriously. And maybe there's a good critique in that, right? That it's not just about wealth, but these artificial constructs, and that people are just trying to protect their own wealth or class. But maybe that's getting too far out from the text at the current moment. And so anyways, Heathcliff comes back, and so we're reconnected and stuff like that. And then Isabella pulls like the classic little sister move, right? Like, oh, like you guys are staying up late and doing fun stuff, and I have to go to bed. It's not fair, right? And Catherine's like, what are you talking about? We're just talking about boring stuff. Didn't think you'd be part of it. And so Heathcliff's like, oh, okay, she's into me. Let me totally use this to my advantage. And so we just embark on this revenge against Edgar, who stole his Catherine. All right, so Catherine marries Edgar, and notice I got the family tree or whatever up here, so we can kind of like figure this out. And so Heathcliff, right, is in love with Catherine, so he marries Catherine's husband's sister, and that becomes part of his revenge, right? He's going to own both estates, and he's going to be able to like lord everything over them, right? As perhaps what has happened to him. All right, so as soon as they get married, though, Isabella realizes it was a mistake. It doesn't take her but a few weeks to write back to her brother and say, and this is in chapter 14 in my version, he is not aware what I suffer. And so then Heathcliff says, well, she cannot accuse me of showing a bit of deceitful softness. The first thing she saw me do on coming out of the Grange was to hang up her little dog. And when she pleaded for it, the first words I uttered were harsh, that I had the hanging of every being belonging to her except one. Possibly she took that exception for herself, but no brutality disgusted her. And so she was blinded, right, by this character of Heathcliff, perhaps because he was, I don't know, the bad boy or the unwanted, or not the unwanted, but the forbidden thing. And so I forget who it was. I'm sorry. In first period said like this book has every romantic movie trope ever in it. And yes, it's true, right? The bad boy is the one that everyone really wants because, hey, I can change him or something, right? Or this is my rebellion, whatever it might be. That's Heathcliff to a T. Isabella falls into that trap. He says he married me on purpose to obtain power over him, being Edgar, and he shan't obtain it. I'll die first, says Isabella. A lot of death in this thing. And in Bronte's life, there was a lot of death. In that time period, there's a lot of death. But but notice that there's this whole idea that like the true upper class, the true gentility, are weak and frail, whereas Heathcliff and those of like the lower class, they are the physically strong. And so again, I think that if we take a Marxist lens, there's a class critique going on through that as well. Okay, so Heathcliff keeps like haunting the garden. This is when Catherine's still alive, right? Like kind of hanging out in the garden near their house. I only wish to hear from herself how she is and why she has been ill, and to ask if anything that I could do would be of use to her. Last night I was in the Grange garden 6 hours, and I'll return there tonight, and every night I'll haunt the place, and every day till I find an opportunity of entering. If Edgar Linton meets me, I shall not hesitate to knock him down, and give him enough to ensure his quiescence while I stay. And so we see that little flip-flop, right? And we see a little bit more of why, like, seeing that ghost was such a big deal to Heathcliff. This is what he was doing, right? He was stuck in the garden trying to get in, just like waiting for his opportunity to see or talk to Catherine. And then Catherine as a ghost does the same thing. He's out in the garden, stuck, can't get in, right? Checking at the window, and so forth. But another thing I noticed in chapter 14 is that when Heathcliff is talking about Catherine, right, the love of his life, his voice changes a little bit, right? Normally he is very, kind of taciturn, doesn't say a lot, but it's like when he does, he's harsh and to the point, right, and even vulgar at times. He calls, their mom a slut, right? And so, anyways, he does say in chapter 14 that he, being Edgar, might as well plant an oak in a flower pot and expect it to thrive, as imagine he can restore her to vigor in the soil of his shallow cares, right? And so like Catherine is this big mighty oak, and Linton, Edgar Linton, does not have the ability to allow her to grow, right? He can't nourish her, right? Heathcliff can nourish her, because but Linton cannot, and that's what he's saying to that. So it's like one of the few times you see Heathcliff using figurative language to describe the differences of the way that they feed and nourish Catherine, him and Edgar. And of course, this is the point he's talking about. He's talking about the love of his life. So out comes the figurative language. Anyways. All right. Then chapter 15 is where we have this like really dramatic kind of like, finally they talk about things, but of course it's too late because, romantic movie trope. It's things like you have killed me, and it's going back to like he is more myself than I, and so like this if you're dead, I'm dead, and all this stuff. I'll talk about the devil throughout. We'll see that, especially when we talk about Heathcliff, the word devil always seems to come up. All right, it's like I wish I could hold you till we were both dead. So Catherine says, I wish I could hold you until we were both dead. If you haven't gotten to the end yet, keep that in mind. It's going to make a lot of sense when you get to the end. Heathcliff remembers this for sure. And then it ties back to the ghost, of course. So anyways, there's a lot of misunderstanding here, right? She's like, oh, what are you going to do? Just like forget about me and go on and have 20 children and stuff like that. And all of a sudden he's like overcome with emotion. And then Ellie says, like, well, see, this is one of the few times that we thought, oh yes, he actually is capable of crying. And we saw that again with the ghost, right? Like Catherine's the one person who can bring out emotion. Heathcliff. There's this realization here that like, oh my gosh, like he does love me just as much, and this whole like he is much a part of me as I am. Like it's mutual, and that's like this whole soulmate thing, right? She says, I only wish us never be parted. And again, that's going to come up later. And they go back and forth with all this kind of stuff, and they kiss, right? And then the really important part here is Heathcliff, getting towards the end really of chapter 15, says, kiss me again and don't let me see your eyes. I forgive what you have done to me. I love my murderer. There's another one of those famous lines that kind of pairs with Catherine's, right? Heathcliff says, I love my murderer, but yours, in other words, your murderer, how can I? So in other words, I love my murderer. I love Earnshaw. I love Catherine. Even though Heathcliff is saying like, with you, when you die, my soul goes with you, and therefore he is like no longer human, and he definitely acts like that at times. But he then says like, how can I forgive your murderer, which she has just said as Heathcliff? How can I ever forgive myself? Is effectively what he's saying in this scene, and this really kind of explains a lot of the motivation, that self-hatred. Explains a lot of the things that happen afterwards in Heathcliff's revenge. Okay, so she dies in childbirth in the next chapter 16. And in chapter 17, once again, we have this concept of Heathcliff being locked out of the gate. And this idea of being locked out of the window, locked out of the gate, right? It's all about if I'm using my Marxist lens, it's about being locked out of that class, right? He's locked out of the estate. He can't ascend, right? And he knows all too well what that feels like, right? Because of course, Catherine's brother Hindley made him feel it all the time, whether it was literally, whether it was like standing with the servants, serving with the servants, and he didn't mind the physical work, but it was like that position was really kind of demeaning. Like after he'd been raised, by their parents, the Earnshaws, as supposed to be equal. So he's put in that position and purposely kept from education. And so the other, so even when he amasses wealth, they find other ways to keep him from truly ascending. So he's locked out of the gate, and so the gates, right, doors, huge motif throughout this, and of course they're symbolic as well. So we see that, and whatever this garden wall was made out of, it must have been unbelievable because no one could seem to get over it, even like the athletic people like Heathcliff, or maybe he disrespects it. But yeah, it's a big deal, right? It's this garden wall. Like you think a state this big, go over it or around it or something, but no, because it's a symbol. And that would be too easy. Anyways, chapter 18. So Kathy Jr. Okay, so Kathy, not Catherine, right? It's now been, she's 13 years old. It's been years since that last scene where we saw Catherine died and Heathcliff was all like, "I love my murderer." She finally kind of stumbles upon Wuthering Heights, which is only a few miles from her house, the nearest house to hers, and they're in the country, it's pretty far apart. But that was like the closest thing to a walking distance house, and she doesn't even know it exists until she's 13. And this is like where her family came from, right? This is where the Earnshaws lived and stuff. That's a little weird. And in fact, she first meets Hareton. Now, talk about this weird switching thing, right? Heathcliff is somehow raising Hareton, but Isabella has run off, and so Heathcliff doesn't even know Linton, his own flesh and blood son at this point. So anyways, Kathy discovers Hareton, and because Hareton is being raised by Heathcliff, he has that sort of gruff manner, and so she thinks he's a servant, when in fact he is her cousin, and she's like, "Oh, that's weird." And here we go back to this contrast, because then in chapter 19, she meets her, quote, real cousin, Linton, who is actually Heathcliff's son, Heathcliff and Isabella, right? And so the, quote, real cousin, or perhaps if we do the Marxist thing, a real class, is sickly and frail and things like this, right? Whereas Hareton, who is raised by Heathcliff, is strong, and despite having the rough exterior and so forth, not even being able to read. Okay, so there's that contrast going to be the next few chapters. And so she kind of takes on this role of being mothering, right? She probably played with dolls her whole life. And so we put on a feminist lens. We see that she is adopting a learned role with her cousin Linton, and saying, because he's sickly, and it's oh, great, this is just an opportunity for me to do this. That and a property rights thing could be an avenue for a feminist reading of this. But anyways, okay, so she's all into Linton because she can take care of him and be in charge of him. So maybe it's a wife of Bat's tail power kind of thing. Who knows? But anyways, Linton ends up going back to Heathcliff, his true father, who doesn't like him, and in fact even goes to so far as to call him his property. Linton doesn't remember Heathcliff. All right, it's been since his baby when they left. And so Heathcliff refers to Linton as property, which again gets back, I think, to this Marxist idea, but also gets to this idea that Heathcliff is just going to use his own son as a pawn, right? He didn't love Isabella. He doesn't love Linton, which is really quite sad. But he's going to use him as a pawn, right? He's going to, as a piece of his property to further extract his revenge on Edgar. So that's, like I said, we're picking up the pace, trying to get back on track here. And then chapter 21, another 3 years go by. So Kathy is, 16, 17, something like that. And so it's time to get her married, because that's what we do back in the day, right? They've been writing back and forth, like Linton and Kathy have been, because of course, they're the only only outlets each other really has, right? And so it's this weird kind of like, if you remember when Catherine was talking to Nellie about like why she was going to marry Edgar, it kind of came down to like he was the only one in the area, right? And so she came up with this list of reasons, and Nellie's like, "There's 100 dudes like that," and Catherine's like, "Yeah, but not here. I can't find them," right? And that's oftentimes what happened, right? You got together with who was in your vicinity and like within your class, within your neighborhood, and that was a very limited pool. And this was happening here, right? Kathy writes to Linton, the only like other literate person she knows, basically, and they this thing happens, and Heathcliff pretends like he doesn't know, but I think he's being coy, right? This has all been orchestrated. All right, so Linton's still weak though. He's writing on the wall for that guy, just like the rest of his family. He's gonna be weak and sickly and die, like everyone who's born in that class in this novel. I'm 192 in my version, but I know yours is different. In chapter 21, Heathcliff is not hiding his plans very well. He doesn't care to. Right? He says, "My design is as honest as possible. I'll inform you of his whole scope," he said, "that the two cousins may fall in love and get married. I'm acting generously to your master. His young chit has no expectations, and should she second my wishes, should be provided for at once, a joint successor with Linton." So from a very practical standpoint, this is what makes the most sense, right? Heathcliff now has all the financial cards. Right? He has the mortgage on the estate. He has, he's basically working himself into owning both estates. And it's like, hey, you want your daughter to be provided for. This is what it often came down to back then. Is like dowries and things like this. Like, it's all about money. Here it is. You have no other options, and that's the unfortunate kind of fact of it, right? And Kathy, I think, has been also kind of manipulated throughout, so she goes along with it. Almost there. So 22, no surprise, Edgar is dying, and once again Heathcliff is stuck outside the wall. And this is like the whole letter thing that I think you knew about. But yeah, it's just that constant reiterating, right? Even when he has some property rights to the house, he's still locked out. That's the Marxist thing. And but he breaks in because that's what's happening symbolically too. And I'll leave you with chapter 23. The rainy night had ushered in a misty morning, half frost, half drizzle, and temporary brooks crossed our path, gurgling from the uplands. All right, and so if you remember the patterns thing, you can probably figure out what sort of scene this is setting for chapter 23 and your final fourth of the novel. Thank you for humoring me this far, and good luck.